This lesson and the following lessons are taking what usability is and applying it to product design, and specifically digital interface design. So best practices in design are sort of standard design patterns and design elements that are used frequently. We see this a lot in websites, but also in apps where, for example, having the search bar in the top right corner is a design best practice that kind of evolved over time, and users have a certain expectation of how a website's going to work. And so from all the many websites that they've used before, they know that the search bar is going to be in the top right corner, and if you then move that search bar, you're causing a moment of confusion or frustration, and you're making your users think, which is not what we want them to do. And so following design best practices will just allow users to follow their mental model of how the website's going to work, and can set you up for success. And so this is where looking at pattern libraries or lists of design best practices can help you just with a really good foundation. It's also just looking at what else is out there. What are other apps doing that are like my app? What are other websites doing? If you have something like a video player, what do other video players look like? Thinking about design best practices and just starting off with a good foundational design is definitely something that applies mostly to the actual visual designers or interaction designers on a product. Maybe a UX researcher would get involved. If you are on the sort of like outskirts of that sort of core team of designers and you're part of the design process, but maybe a product manager, knowing what the standards are is still really helpful and could be brought in as a reason for potentially changing a design or suggesting an alternative. There are so many different ways to design a product. There's not just one way to do it, and so looking at what other people have done is beneficial for everyone. Even in the sort of concept stages of planning for a product or planning for a new feature within your app, it can be really helpful to look at what's out there and what the best practices are, what people's expectations are. This applies to everyone, but probably most so to the designers who are actually going to be creating the visual look and feel of the final design. If you're interested in learning more about best practices and design patterns, I've included several links to articles and books on this topic in the class resources. There's something else that you can use and sort of principles you can follow in designing to avoid usability issues. And these are more guiding principles, more of a mindset to take on and a philosophy to follow. But it's really meant to be sort of more of a mindset. And these are typically called usability guidelines or a certain set of heuristics. And this applies obviously to many more fields than just design and usability and user experience. But it's things like show empathy for your users or avoid distractions. So it's less of a specific where a design guideline or design best practice would be something super specific. This is a little bit higher level, and these usability heuristics can be really nice as sort of a manifesto for your team and say, we're going to follow these principles in designing, and that's going to apply to everything that we do. This is also the basis for what I will talk about in one of the components of the project for this course, is doing a heuristic evaluation. So looking at the list of heuristics and saying, do we avoid distractions for our users, and what are possible distractions that could come up? It could be a really interesting and fun exercise to sit down with your team and create your own usability heuristics. I would recommend looking at some of the existing resources that are out there, and just a quick Google search for usability heuristics brings up a lot of different lists. The three that I tend to refer back to the most are Jacob Nielsen's, Whitney Hess's, and Susan Weinshank's. Susan talks a lot more about the psychology, the reasons for usability issues. That's what I talked about in the previous lesson. But it can be a really helpful reminder. So if your team doesn't show a lot of empathy or doesn't have a lot of knowledge on sort of the users and people's mindset, it can be really helpful to think about why, like trying to focus on attention, and that people have just sort of limited attention span. Whitney Hess's and Jacob Nielsen's usability heuristics are much more specific to avoiding usability issues and more in the design rather than the psychology behind them, they all kind of have the same outcome. And just some examples are Winnie Hess talks about presenting few choices as one of her usability heuristics, and she actually calls it design principle. And the idea behind that being that if we overwhelm our users with too many options, they don't know where to go and don't know what to click, don't know what to do next. And that if we can narrow down people's choices, it'll be much easier for them to pick one. Another one of Whitney Hess's that I really like is provide strong information sent. And this isn't something she came up with more than someone else. All three of these lists of usability heuristics and anything you find out there, the really good ones are based on years of research and studying human behavior and looking at what makes a good interface. And so Whitney Hess's one on strong information sent actually relates to a word or a phrase in an interface and whether or not people know what that's going to go to. And so if you have a link in your app and you want people to click on it, it has to be really, really clear to them what that's going to take them to and where that's going to lead. And so something, if you think about how animals hunt for food, humans hunt for information. And so you want to make sure that it's really clear where they're going to go. So a link like click here has really poor information sent because it can go anywhere. Whereas a link like books is really straightforward. But this is also why sometimes you need a much longer link. So you might need to link to download class resources and have all three clickable so that it's clear what you're going to get by tapping or clicking on that link. One of Jacob Nielsen's usability heuristics is visibility of the system status. And really what this means is making sure that your system, that the product that you're building gives feedback to users so that when they take action, it's clear that the system has heard them and has understood that something is going on, even if you need a moment on the back end to process that. So if someone taps a button and the new page has to load, this happens a lot with very image-heavy websites and apps, that there's a little loading icon, that something's happening. And just that little bit of feedback gives users such a sense of security and calmness that they don't panic, because otherwise people end up tapping the same button many, many times or clicking the link over and over again because they're not sure if something happened or not, or they kind of panic and think that the computer might have frozen. So that's one that I tend to think about a lot, and it's one that you can actually kind of walk through the use of your system and make sure that at each moment is it clear to the user that the action was understood when they click on something, tap on something, do something, fill in information and hit enter. Is it processing? If you're considering coming up with your own set of usability heuristics for your team to follow, I definitely recommend looking at some of the lists that are out there already. So doing a quick search for usability heuristics brings up a lot of lists. I've also included several of my favorite in the class resources, and then kind of going through and picking and choosing the ones that really resonate to you or resonate to your team. Jacob Nielsen has 10 in his list of usability heuristics. Whitney Hess has 20. You can find lists of 30. There are probably 50 usability heuristics out there. Sometimes they're called design guidelines. But depending a little bit on your team size, but also just their familiarity with thinking about user-centered design, so thinking about who's going to be the end user of a product, I would definitely try to limit the list to 5 or 10 that have an impact. So another way to think about it is also if there's something that's been a problem for you or for your team in the past that you know you haven't done a good job at, maybe when people hit errors on your site, they tend to hit a dead end. You don't do a really good job helping them recover from those errors. And this is one of Jacob Nielsen's usability heuristics. And so providing them a way out, a way back to the home page, a way back to other places would be a reason to include that heuristic over maybe one that you know you do well, that sort of everyone believes in and follows in their design. I think following a iterative approach to anything is healthy, to sort of say this is what we're going to start with, see how that works. It can be really good to use the set that you think you should start with and then 6 months later kind of reevaluate. It's probably not something you're going to be changing on a 2-week basis because it's you really want to sort of instill this new way of thinking and this new philosophy in your like broader design team. And so, yeah, like adapting and changing is probably a good approach, but not too frequently. So following design best practices and usability heuristics is a really, really great place to start, because it means you're not starting from scratch. You're following certain standards that are out there that users expect. But it's not the only way to ensure a great design, and it's actually one that still causes lots of usability problems, because there's many, many ways to avoid distractions in an interface, for example. And so really, truly, the only way to know whether or not your system is going to work well for the people that will be using it is to actually watch people use it. And so to put the design, even if it's a very, very early sketch of something, put it in front of people who might be your end user, and see what they do, see what they think, see how they interpret the information. And this also comes back to mental models. Like, you intended for it to be used a certain way. You intended for that link to mean a certain thing. Does it actually mean that to your users? And this is really the basis of usability testing, which just comes down to giving people activities to do that they would typically do on your product or using your product, and then seeing what happens.